They fired me while the room was still clapping. Imagine that. 300 people in a glass-walled auditorium, applause echoing like I just won an award. Except it wasn't an award. It was my execution. The CEO, Adrien Cole, smiled for the cameras, praised my years of dedication, and then, with the same breath, announced my termination. I stood there frozen, hearing the cheer roll over me like waves. For a second, it felt almost surreal, like maybe I'd misheard. But no. They had packaged my downfall as a celebration. My colleagues avoided my eyes. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one stood up. Not one. Inside, a storm was breaking. I'd spent over a decade building this company from nothing. Patents, prototypes, nights of burnt coffee, and endless coding. And now, I was being erased with applause. Do you know what it's like to have your life's work applauded out of your hands? To be told you're honored, even as you're being discarded? The applause didn't sting because it was loud. It stung because it was hollow. And in that hollowness, something inside me shifted. I realized silence could be sharper than shouting. And while Adrien thought he'd just buried me under applause, he had no idea he'd actually lit the fuse. Before I tell you how it all unfolded, where are you watching from today? And deeper than that, have you ever been made to feel invisible in a place you gave everything to? Leave me a comment if this stirs a memory. Your story could be the reminder someone else needs that they're not alone in this. When I first walked into that tiny office, it didn't even feel like a company. It was a broom closet with a flickering light and an air conditioner that rattled like an old train. The carpet smelled of dust, and the only coffee machine burned everything it touched. But to me, it was the start of something bigger. I remember staying long after everyone else had gone home. My desk was covered in wires, circuit boards, and half-written notes. I wasn't chasing fame. I wasn't even chasing money. I just wanted to build something real, something that worked. Every late night felt like a gamble, but I kept betting on myself. One by one, the patents started to pile up. First, it was a small automation process, something nobody thought would matter. Then came the breakthroughs in pharmaceutical systems, the kind that shaved months off development cycles. By the time I filed my 16th patent, the company had outgrown that broom closet. We moved into a sleek office downtown, 3 stories of glass and steel. People like to say Adrien Cole was the visionary, but the truth? I was the engine. The contracts, the revenue streams, the investors lining up, it all came from the ideas I turned into blueprints, then into working systems. I was proud of it. Maybe too proud, because pride can blind you. Still, I believed in loyalty. I thought if I gave everything, my time, my energy, even my health, this company would protect me the way I had protected it. I thought I belonged. Looking back now, maybe I should have noticed the warning signs, the closed-door meetings, the way my name slowly disappeared from presentations, the growing distance between me and the board. At the time, though, I told myself, keep building, keep moving. I didn't realize I was laying the tracks for someone else to drive the train. And soon enough, someone new was about to take the wheel. The first time I met Adrien Cole, he walked into the office like he already owned the building. His suit was flawless, his watch probably worth more than my first year's salary, and his smile, well, it was the kind of smile that looked practiced in front of a mirror. Everyone noticed him. Some whispered that the board had brought him in to take us to the next level. I noticed something else. He talked a lot, but he didn't say much. Words like synergy, scalability, next-gen optimization, phrases that filled the room without ever touching the ground. My engineers called it word salad, but in the boardroom, it worked like magic. People nodded, even if they didn't understand. I still remember the first meeting we had together. He walked around the table, rested a hand on my prototype, and said, This is the kind of innovation we'll brand under my new vision. He didn't even look at me when he said it, like I wasn't sitting right there. At first, I tried to shrug it off. Maybe he was just overconfident, maybe he'd learn. But week by week, the pattern grew. My budget was slashed in half. Meetings I had always led suddenly disappeared from my calendar. Engineers who had worked by my side for years were reassigned without a word of explanation. It wasn't just business, it was erasure. And the strange thing is, no one really pushed back. Adrien had a way of making resistance look like disloyalty. Speak up and you were not aligned with the company's future. Stay quiet and you became invisible. I told myself to focus on the work, to let the results speak louder than his speeches. But deep down, I could feel it. A storm was building. And Adrien wasn't here to build alongside me. He was here to take the driver's seat. The question was, how far would he go to push me out of my own creation? It happened at the quarterly investor review in New York. The room was filled with polished suits, expensive colognes, and the quiet hum of money at work. I had spent months refining our system, nights running simulations, days troubleshooting code, until the numbers lined up perfectly. This was supposed to be the moment the project spoke for itself. Adrien walked onto the stage like he was stepping into a spotlight built just for him. He carried no prototypes, no data sheets, none of the late nights or missed meals that had gone into the work. Just slides, slick, branded, and renamed. He called it neurogrid optimization. My work, stripped of context, dressed in his language. I sat in the audience, my heart pounding, as I watched graphs I had generated appear on the big screen. He didn't stumble once. Every technical breakthrough was repackaged as a strategic initiative under my leadership. He even paused for effect when the investors leaned forward nodding, as if his vision alone had carried us this far. There was a moment, just a flicker, when his eyes met mine across the room. Not a glance of respect, not even acknowledgement. It was the look of someone daring me to object, daring me to stand and claim what was mine. I stayed seated. Around me, colleagues shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a junior engineer I had mentored, slipped a sticky note onto my desk later that day. "We know it's yours." I appreciated it, but sticky notes don't change board votes. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm. Bursting out in anger would only play into his hands. Instead, I started documenting. Every slide, every word, every quiet erasure of my name. If he wanted the spotlight, I would let him take it. But I wasn't planning to disappear into the shadows. Because the more he talked, the more I realized something important. The higher he climbed on my work, the harder his fall would be. And it wouldn't take long before the cracks began to show. The boardroom was colder than usual that morning. The blinds were half-drawn, streaks of pale light cutting across the long oak table. I walked in with my notes, expecting another routine review. Instead, I noticed something out of place in the corner, a paper shredder plugged in and humming softly, like it had been waiting for this moment. Adrien was already there, pacing slowly, rehearsing his lines under his breath. The board members filed in one by one, their faces unreadable. When the meeting began, he didn't waste time. He tapped his hand on the stack of contracts, my contracts, and smiled that rehearsed smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we take the next step in evolving this company. To do that, we must also let go of the past." Before I could react, he lifted the stack, fed the first page into the shredder, and let the machine devour it inch by inch. The sound was deafening. Every rip of paper felt like a verdict, like years of my work being swallowed in front of an audience. I looked around the table. Some board members shifted in their seats. A few avoided eyes contact completely. No one stopped him. Not one. When the last page disappeared, he turned to me. "Clara," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "your contributions will always be remembered. But as of today, your role here is finished. We need fresh energy, new blood." I felt every eye in the room land on me. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay still. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply gathered my notes, slid my pen into my pocket, and said 2 words. Duly noted. The silence that followed was heavier than the shredding had been. Adrien smirked, thinking he had won. But deep inside, I knew something he didn't. That shredder hadn't just destroyed paper. It had triggered something far more dangerous. And soon, he would learn exactly what that meant. That night, after the so-called farewell, I didn't go home. I ended up in the same diner I'd been visiting for years, the one tucked under the rattling tracks of the elevated train. The place smelled like burnt toast and strong coffee, but it was quiet. And in that quiet, I opened a folder I hadn't touched in years. Inside were the original contracts, the ones I had signed back when this company was barely breathing. Everyone else had rushed to update their paperwork whenever new leadership demanded it. I didn't. Call it stubbornness or maybe instinct. And there it was, buried in the fine print like a sleeping guard dog. A clause I had fought for back then when nobody thought the company would survive long enough for it to matter. Intellectual property reversion in the event of breach. In plain words, if the company ever destroyed or failed to maintain original agreements tied to my patents, ownership snapped back to me. I traced the words with my finger, almost disbelieving. Adrien had paraded a shredder into the boardroom thinking he was humiliating me. What he had really done was tear apart the very contracts that bound my work to the company. He had triggered the breach himself. I wasn't alone in this. Across the table sat Victor, my lawyer and old friend. He had the look of a retired boxer, broad shoulders, sharp eyes, and a patience that could outlast anyone. He sipped his coffee, scanned the document, and gave a small nod. "You kept this clause alive all these years?" he asked. "I never trusted them enough to sign it away," I said. Victor leaned back, a slow grin forming. "Then you're not out, Clara. They are." For the first time since the applause that ended my career, I felt the weight shift. Not completely, not yet, but enough to know the game wasn't over. And the next move would be mine. Victor didn't waste time. The very next morning, he drafted the breach notice and attached every piece of proof we had scanned contracts, timestamps, notarized copies, even the blockchain hash I had insisted on embedding years ago. The email was short, almost clinical, but I knew the effect it would have once it landed in their inbox. By noon, the silence broke. My phone buzzed with messages from old colleagues. "What did you do? Systems are frozen. Adrien looks like he's aged 10 years in a day." Because here's the thing. Every factory line, every client portal, every automated system was built on the patents tied to that clause. Without my authorization, they weren't licensed to use any of it. And when the contracts were shredded, so was their right to run the machine. The first shutdown came from our manufacturing partner in Detroit. 6 hours of downtime, each hour bleeding tens of thousands in lost output. Then the German client pulled out of a meeting demanding certification from the original patent holder. That title was mine now, whether Adrien wanted to admit it or not. I could picture the panic inside their glass tower headquarters. Legal teams scrambling, engineers locked out of code repositories, board members demanding answers Adrien couldn't give. Every minute that ticked by was money, burning, credibility slipping. I didn't gloat, I didn't post online or call anyone out. I just sat in that diner, coffee in hand, watching the storm I had quietly set in motion. Victor leaned over the table checking his phone. "They're cornered," he said simply. I nodded. It wasn't victory yet, but for the first time in weeks, I wasn't the one trapped. And soon, the sharks in the water would smell blood. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. Within 48 hours of the breach notice, my inbox was no longer quiet. It turned into something else entirely, a feeding frenzy. The first email came from a competitor in Boston. Polite, almost casual. If you're open to discussions, we'd love to explore an acquisition of your portfolio. Then another from a European conglomerate promising a strategic partnership with generous terms. By the end of the week, there were half a dozen more. Private equity firms, tech CEOs I'd only read about in magazines, each one circling, each one trying to outbid the last. I sat in the same booth at the diner Victor across from me while the offers stacked higher. One message read, 7 figures up front. Another pushed harder, name your price, we'll beat it. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. Smells like blood in the water, he said. And he was right. Adrien's mistake had turned me from discarded employee into the most valuable free agent in the industry. Everyone knew the company was exposed. Everyone knew I held the keys. And yet, I didn't rush. That was the hardest part, resisting the urge to grab the first lifeline. Instead, I let the sharks circle, let the water churn. Every hour I stayed silent, the bidding war sharpened. But with every new offer, I also knew Adrien had to be watching. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't pretend the patents were still his when the market was treating me like the rightful owner. The balance of power was shifting fast, too fast for Adrien to contain. Victor leaned forward, tapping the screen of his phone where another offer had just landed. They're not just circling anymore, he said. They're closing in. I looked out the diner window at the rain streaking down the glass and thought to myself, if the sharks were this hungry, what would Adrien do to keep me from handing them the kill? It was only a matter of time before Adrien came back to me. He didn't call directly, of course. That would have meant admitting defeat. Instead, one of his assistants requested a private meeting to discuss resolution. We met in a glass conference room overlooking the city skyline. Adrien walked in wearing the same perfect suit, but the confidence was cracked. His tie was a little too loose, his smile a little too forced. Clara, he began, lowering his voice like we were old friends, we don't need to make this ugly. You've made your point. Let's put this behind us. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was an offer a payout that looked generous on paper, at least to anyone who didn't know better. A lump sum, no royalties, no acknowledgement. Just hush money, neatly disguised as compensation. I closed the folder without even finishing the last page. Adrien, I said quietly, you're not negotiating from strength. You're negotiating from panic. His jaw tightened. You think those sharks circling you care about you? They'll chew you up and spit you out. I'm offering stability. Security. I leaned back, letting his words hang in the air. You're offering scraps. Meanwhile, they're offering a seat at the table. Big difference. For the first time, his voice slipped. You're trying to bankrupt us. No, I corrected him. I'm giving you a choice. I pulled 2 documents from my bag and set them down between us. The first, a licensing agreement under my terms. The second, a draft sale to one of his biggest competitors. You can sign the first and keep operating, I said. Or I can sign the second, and you'll be explaining to your board why the crown jewels of your company now belong to someone else. The silence stretched thick as the city fog pressing against the glass. Adrien stared at the papers, his fingers twitching but not moving. And I knew then he wasn't just fighting for control anymore. He was fighting for survival. The boardroom felt like a stage that day. Every leather chair was filled, every eye sharp with calculation. Papers rustled, whispers floated, but when I walked in the room, shifted. They weren't expecting me to stand tall after what Adrien had done. But I wasn't here as the discarded employee anymore. I was here as the owner of the one thing they couldn't replace. Adrien started first, his tone clipped and defensive. She's trying to extort us. None of this is legal. His voice rose, but there was a tremor beneath it. I didn't bother raising mine. I laid 2 folders neatly on the table and slid them forward. This is not extortion. This is choice. The license agreement is clear. $10 million upfront, 30% of net profits for the next 5 years. Or, I tapped the second folder, I finalized this deal with your largest competitor, and they'll happily pay for the privilege of tearing you apart piece by piece." The room went quiet. Even the air conditioner seemed to hesitate. A board member cleared his throat, eyes darting from me to Adrien. "You don't have to listen to this," Adrien snapped. I looked him straight in the eye. "Power doesn't beg, Adrien. It invoices." That line hung in the air like a hammer waiting to fall. One by one, the board members leaned forward, flipping through the documents. I saw the calculation in their eyes, how much it would cost to fight me, how much they'd lose if I walked out the door. Finally, one of them turned to Adrien. "We can't afford a war we'll lose." The decision was no longer his to make. He tried to object, but his words stumbled hollow. For the first time, I saw the cracks in his carefully polished image. The man who had strutted into this company with rehearsed smiles now looked like someone cornered, gasping for air. And that was when I knew the battle wasn't just about contracts anymore. It was about who would leave this room with their reputation intact and who would be remembered as the man who destroyed everything. The silence broke with the sound of a pen scratching across paper. One board member signed, then another and another. Adrien tried to interrupt, his voice sharp with desperation, but no one listened. They all knew the math. Fighting me would drain them dry. Signing meant survival. When the final signature landed, the agreement was sealed. $10 million upfront, wired immediately, plus a share of profits that would flow for years. The same company that had fired me was now locked into paying me not as an employee, but as the rightful owner of the very core they had tried to bury. The folder was slid back across the table, ink still wet. I didn't gloat, I didn't smile. I simply picked it up, tucked it under my arm, and stood. Adrien's eyes burned into me, but the arrogance was gone. All that remained was the look of a man who realized he'd been outplayed at his own game. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. On my way out, one of the board members muttered almost under his breath, "She built the engine. We just tried to run it without fuel." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever hear. Victor was waiting for me in the lobby, leaning casually against the wall with his hands in his pockets. When I walked up, he smirked. "So, hash browns or champagne?" I let out the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. "Both," I said. "Definitely both." We stepped out into the evening air, the city lights reflecting off the glass towers above us. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight lift. Not completely, but enough. Because this wasn't the end of the story. Signing the deal had given me back control. But what I chose to do with it, that would define everything that came next. And I already knew exactly where I was heading. A few weeks later, I finally drove out of the city. No boardrooms, no shredded contracts, no artificial smiles. Just miles of open road leading to a quiet lake house I'd almost forgotten I owned. The place was simple, wooden walls that smelled faintly of pine, a dock that creaked under my steps, and water so still it reflected the sky like glass. I sat on the porch that first evening, watching the sun sink low, the horizon painted in fire and gold. My phone buzzed nonstop updates, from lawyers, notices from the company, even half-hearted messages from people who once pretended not to see me. I turned it off. For the first time in years, I let silence be more than just a weapon. I let it be peace. The company carried on without me, but not without cost. Adrien kept his title, but his power was gone. Every roadmap, every press release, every shiny announcement had a footnote, now licensed from Clara Hayes. A quiet reminder that they could never erase the foundation they tried to bury. I thought revenge would feel louder, but it didn't. It felt steady, like reclaiming a piece of myself I had handed over too easily. I didn't win by shouting or by fighting harder. I won by knowing my worth, protecting it, and refusing to let anyone take it away. That's the real lesson I carried with me on those quiet nights by the lake. Contracts aren't just paper, and loyalty means nothing if it isn't mutual. Sometimes the best justice is building a life so steady that no one else can shake it. So let me ask you, what would you have done in my place? Would you have fought back or walked away? Leave a comment. Your story might remind someone that they're not as powerless as they think.